An ordinary fisherman thought he would find a catch in his net's dot, but the sea returned a rusty metal cylinder dot. When he decided to open it, inside was something that left even seasoned sailors speechless. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. The horizon was only just beginning to blush with the pale colors of dawn when the sea awakened from its night of silence. The small wooden fishing boat swayed lightly on the gentle waves, the creaking of its boards like the groans of an old companion that had long since given up protesting against time. Salt hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint sour odor of nets that had been repaired and mended countless times. Seagulls wheeled above in slow, lazy arcs, their cries sharp and impatient, as if they too demanded their share of the morning's catch. The man at the center of this scene, a fisherman hardened by years of toil, rose slowly from where he had been crouching. His skin bore the dark tone of the southern coast, sun-scorched and sea-worn, his face a mosaic of fine lines etched by wind, salt, and worry. He was not yet old, perhaps just beyond 40, but in the depth of his gaze lived the fatigue of someone who had seen more struggle than peace. His hands, calloused and scarred, handled the ropes with the precision of long practice. He did not think about each knot he tied or each loop he cast. The gestures belonged to muscle and memory more than to conscious thought. His mornings never varied much. He woke before the first light, gathered his meager supplies, and pushed the boat out from the rocky shoreline where it waited like a loyal beast of burden. The oars knew his rhythm, the sails his breath, the nets his hope. There was little in his life beyond this cycle. He lived in a modest shack not far from the harbor, a place built more by necessity than by comfort. The wooden walls leaned inward with age, the roof patched from storms that had threatened to collapse it, but it was home. Within that shack had once been laughter, the voice of a woman, and the small steps of a boy, but all of that had ebbed away as surely as the tide itself. His wife had died young, his son had grown restless and left for the city. The fisherman was left with only the sea, the one companion that never abandoned him, though it demanded endless toil in exchange. He carried all this with him now, though he spoke of it to no one. The sea did not require words. It required patience, endurance, and obedience. He had learned this lesson from his father, who too had lived and died by the sea. The old man had vanished one stormy night when the waves rose taller than houses and the winds screamed like demons. His body was never found. The fisherman, then only a boy, had waited for weeks with his mother, watching the empty horizon for a sail that never returned. From that time forward, he understood that the sea could be both provider and executioner. This morning felt, at first, like any other. He cast his nets with practiced motions, the rope hissing as it slid through his fingers before slapping against the water. He watched as the weights dragged the mesh downward, sinking into the dark world below. For a while, he stood silently, scanning the surface for signs of movement. His thoughts wandered, as they often did, to the endless worries of survival. Would today bring enough fish to trade for bread, oil, and perhaps a little wine? Would the weather hold steady, or would storms brew suddenly, as they sometimes did, turning the calm waters into a battlefield? He thought, too, of his son, far away in the city, perhaps awake at that very moment, but staring not at waves and sky, but at stone streets and smoke. The fisherman breathed deeply, letting the salt bite into his lungs. This air was his inheritance, his curse, and his solace. He pulled the first length of rope experimentally, testing the weight of the net below. Usually, he could tell by feel whether it held promise. Today it was light, too light, and he frowned. Another toss, another wait. The sea was fickle. It gave or withheld at its own whim, and men like him had no power over its decisions. Yet still he returned each day, just as his father had, just as countless men before them had. Time passed with the slow inevitability of morning. The light grew stronger, painting the water with streaks of gold. The cries of the gulls sharpened, their circles tighter, as if they sensed something he did not. He squinted toward the horizon. There were no other boats in sight. That was not unusual. Many fishermen preferred different coasts or deeper waters. He preferred solitude, and the sea seemed to respect that, wrapping him in its silence. As he prepared to draw in the nets once more, his mind drifted back to stories told by elders at the harbor, half in jest, half in warning. They spoke of strange things pulled from the depths, wreckage from old wars, crates of forgotten cargo, barrels of fuel, even bones sealed inside rusted iron. He had laughed once, as a boy, thinking these tales little more than drunken exaggerations. Yet, with age, he had come to believe that the sea indeed held secrets. It was too vast, too merciless, not to hide the evidence of human folly within its dark belly. He shook off these thoughts. Superstitions had no place in his work. A fisherman's task was simple. Cast, wait, pull, and repeat until the body ached and the day was gone. He reached for his flask, sipping the lukewarm water that tasted faintly of tin. It would be another long day. He wiped the sweat already forming on his brow and turned back to the nets. What he could not know then, as the gulls screamed louder and the ropes began to tense in his hands, was that this day would not pass like the countless others. For the sea had decided to return something. Not fish, not the bounty of ordinary labor, but something else. Something heavier, stranger, and infinitely more dangerous. He felt the first tug then, a resistance in the rope unlike any he had known before. It was not the frantic pull of fish caught and thrashing, nor the sluggish drag of seaweed entangled. It was something dense, deliberate, and immovable. His brows furrowed as he braced his legs and tightened his grip. The boat shifted slightly, dipping toward the side where the net had sunk. He gritted his teeth, pulling harder, the cords cutting into his skin. This was no ordinary morning. The sea had offered him a gift or a curse, and it would change everything. The sun climbed higher, bright and indifferent, as though the world remained unchanged. But the fisherman knew better. He could feel it in the line, in the way his heart had begun to beat faster, in the sudden stillness that seemed to envelop the water around him. The sea was giving something back, and he would soon discover what. And so began the morning that would mark the end of his ordinary days. The ropes strained beneath his hands, and the fisherman's body tensed instinctively, every muscle remembering years of hauling nets heavy with fish or tangled with seaweed. Yet this was different. The weight he felt now was not alive, not darting and thrashing with the desperate struggle of creatures pulled from their world into his. This was something solid, heavy, stubborn, as though the sea itself had decided to cling to what it held and resist him. He planted his feet firmly on the wet planks of the boat, the boards groaning under his shifting weight. The morning sun was climbing higher, but a strange chill threaded through his spine as he braced himself and pulled harder. At first, he thought it might be a large school of fish, their combined weight dragging against the mesh. But fish always moved, always fought in unison or thrashed against the net with chaotic bursts. This was still, too still, as if the rope were tied to some anchored object deep in the sand. His thoughts flickered briefly to the possibility of a great shark or even a sea turtle ensnared, but such creatures would not have remained silent. The line was mute, unyielding, and the silence it carried was more unsettling than any violent struggle could have been. The boat dipped to one side, responding to the drag from below. Water lapped over the edges of the hull in thin sheets, and he had to adjust his stance to keep his balance. The air around him thickened with tension. Even the gulls, which had circled greedily moments before, now hovered at a distance, their cries fewer, sharper, as if they too sensed something unnatural. The fisherman felt the rope cut deeper into the hardened calluses of his palms as he tried to gauge the pull, his mind racing through every possibility. Perhaps it was a piece of wreckage, some forgotten relic of a ship that had gone down in a storm. Such finds were not unheard of, though rare. He remembered the old stories told in hushed voices at the harbor, tales of barrels filled with fuel, crates of long-lost cargo, or even bones sealed away in rusted iron coffins. He had always dismissed them as half-truths born from superstition, but now, with the line trembling in his grip, those tales seemed less like exaggerations and more like warnings. The fisherman tightened his jaw, sweat rolling down his temples despite the coolness of the morning breeze. He began to pull with more force, hand over hand, each movement deliberate and measured. The weight shifted slightly, and he felt the object below begin to rise, though sluggishly, as if reluctant to leave the seabed. Sand and silt must have buried it, he thought, and now the net was tearing it loose. The resistance made his heart pound harder. He could picture the shape in his imagination. A broken mast, perhaps, or a sunken crate, bloated with seawater and clinging to the earth beneath the waves. As the rope shortened, the sea began to bubble faintly near the starboard side. At first it was nothing more than ripples disturbed by the upward pull, but soon a patch of foam spread outward, a sign that something immense was breaking free from the deep. His pulse quickened. He had caught strange things before. Rusty anchors, barrels, even the skeleton of a small boat, but never had he felt such mass. This was not driftwood. This was not something natural carried by current. This was something crafted, shaped by hands like his, though for what purpose he could not yet imagine. The boat rocked violently as the weight surged upward. The fisherman grunted, his back straining as he pulled with every ounce of strength in his body. His shoulders burned, his breath came ragged, and still the object fought him, as though the sea were loath to surrender it. Then, suddenly, the resistance shifted. The unseen thing below yielded an inch, then another, and the boat lurched upward as if freed from a tether. The fisherman stumbled but did not release the rope. He wrapped it twice around a cleat at the edge of the boat, securing it, then leaned over the side to peer into the water. The sun caught the surface at an angle, and for a fleeting moment he saw it. A shadow too large, too regular to be natural. Rectangular, perhaps, or cylindrical, he could not tell through the distortion of the waves. It loomed just beneath, moving with ponderous slowness as the net dragged it higher. His throat tightened. This was no accident of drift. Whatever it was had been built, constructed deliberately. He pulled again, more cautiously this time, wary of capsizing his boat. The shadow thickened, solidified until the shape became undeniable. It was no mast, no broken hull. It was something else entirely, something alien to the simplicity of the sea. The gulls screeched above him, circling again, their cries shrill like warnings. The fisherman's hands trembled on the rope. He thought of letting it go, of cutting the line and abandoning the catch to the depths where it belonged. But curiosity held him fast. He had lived his life on these waters, seen all their moods, weathered their storms and silences. Never had the sea offered him something so strange. His father's voice echoed faintly in his memory. The sea gives and the sea takes, and sometimes what it gives is not a blessing. Still he pulled. The rope groaned, the cleat strained, and the boat swayed dangerously with each heave. The shadow beneath grew darker, closer, until it was only a few feet from breaking the surface. The fisherman's breath hitched. His heart pounded with a rhythm not unlike the crash of distant waves. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that this was no ordinary morning's work. The sea was returning something it had hidden, and he, whether by fate or folly, had been chosen to bring it back into the light. The water churned now, frothing white as though reluctant to reveal the secret it had kept. The fisherman wiped his brow with the back of his arm, his eyes fixed on the patch of sea where the object would soon appear. His muscles trembled with exhaustion, yet anticipation drove him onward. He pulled one final time, the net taut as a bowstring, and the thing below rose higher still. What emerged, he realized, would not be fish, nor even wreckage. It would be something heavier, older, stranger. And as the sea prepared to give it up, the fisherman felt the first true weight of fear settle in his chest. The water foamed and writhed as if reluctant to surrender its secret, and the fisherman leaned back against the pull of the rope, his breath labored and his muscles trembling. The weight in the net heaved toward the surface with a stubborn, uneven rhythm, each upward surge followed by a pause, as though the sea itself were trying to drag it back down. His boat creaked under the strain, the planks moaning and shifting as if they too resented the burden laid upon them. He dug his heels against the damp wood, feeling the cold bite of salt spray against his cheeks, every nerve alert and strung taut. This was no ordinary object. The sea, he realized with growing unease, was returning something unnatural, something that had no business resting in its belly. At last, the surface broke, and what lay beneath came into view. Rising slowly, ponderously, like some beast long asleep and unwilling to wake, was a great metal cylinder. Its rounded flanks shimmered with wetness as it breached the waterline, his body coated with layers of algae and barnacles that had claimed it as their home. The thing was massive, larger than anything he had ever drawn up from the deep, nearly the length of his boat, and of a thickness that dwarfed him. The fisherman stared, his chest tight, his breathing shallow, as the full reality of it emerged before his eyes. The object settled heavily against the side of the boat, and the net strained and sagged under its bulk. It was shaped with deliberate design, its curvature too exact to be natural. It resembled an enormous cistern, a storage tank perhaps, though its age and the sea's patient corrosion had left it scarred and almost unrecognizable. Rust streaked its surface in jagged trails, mingling with the green of sea moss and the pale crust of barnacles. Patches of metal had bubbled and split, revealing blackened seams beneath. And yet, despite the ravages of time, the cylinder remained whole, intact, a ghost of its original purpose still imprinted on its shape. The fisherman's first instinct was disbelief. He had expected perhaps a crate, a barrel, or a piece of wreckage torn free from some sunken hulk. But this was something else entirely. He crouched near the edge of the boat, his eyes darting across its corroded surface. His heart pounded in his chest with a force that almost hurt, and he could not rid himself of the notion that the object was somehow alive, not with breath or blood, but with a presence, as though it had carried with it the weight of everything it had seen and endured in the darkness below. With great effort, he worked the net to maneuver the cylinder, dragging it inch by inch until its rounded body lay cradled against the deck. The boat groaned, protesting, its balance shifting precariously with the added mass. He steadied himself, fear tightening his throat as he considered the risk of capsizing. But the sea had gone calm, as if watching, as if waiting for him to complete the task it had set before him. Not a wave rose against him now. The horizon stretched smooth and silent, disturbed only by the faint cries of distant gulls. The fisherman rose to his feet and circled the object cautiously. He touched the side with the tip of his boot, and the hollow thud that answered seemed to echo louder than it should have, reverberating not just in his ears but in his bones. He bent lower, his fingers brushing against the corroded surface, the slime of algae slick beneath his touch. The chill that seeped into his skin was not just of water or rust, but of something older, deeper. He recoiled slightly, wiping his hand on his trousers, his breath quickening. As he moved closer to the bow, his eyes caught something along the side of the cylinder. Beneath the layers of rust and marine growth, faint marks were visible, straight lines that might once have been letters or numbers. He squinted, scraping gently with a knife, clearing away enough to glimpse fragments of characters, an L, perhaps, followed by something that looked like 09 or 06. They meant nothing to him, not as they stood, but they were proof beyond doubt that this was no accident of nature. Men had built this. Men had cast it into the sea, and for reasons he could not yet guess, the sea had decided to return it to him. The fisherman's gaze swept across the rest of the cylinder. Near its base, half hidden by corrosion, he noticed seams in the metal, lines too precise to be cracks. They looked like the edges of a hatch or a welded plate. He crouched, leaning closer, his ear pressed to the cold surface. For a moment, he thought he heard something faint inside, a shifting, a hollow echo like the roll of a stone or the clink of metal against metal. He froze, his skin prickling, his breath caught in his chest. Then silence returned, heavy and suffocating, as if the thing had only teased him with the sound. A shiver ran through him. He rose quickly, his eyes scanning the horizon for reassurance, but the sea remained empty, indifferent. Alone on his small vessel, the fisherman realized he had in his possession something he neither understood nor wanted, and yet he could not bring himself to release it. His instincts screamed to cut the net, to push the cylinder back into the waves and let the sea reclaim its burden. But curiosity anchored him as firmly as the object's weight had anchored his boat moments before. He needed to know. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his body trembling from the strain of the haul and the intensity of his own thoughts. The sun now burned high overhead, its warmth at odds with the cold knot of dread in his chest. His boat rocked gently, as if to remind him of his isolation. The cylinder lay silent, its secrets locked within, but its presence filled every corner of the deck, shrinking the space until he felt hemmed in, trapped with it. He tried to picture what might lie inside. Was it simply a tank of fuel, cast overboard long ago by some vessel unwilling to risk inspection, or perhaps cargo, sealed away to preserve it, though what kind of cargo would be hidden in such a way he could not imagine. Then darker thoughts intruded. What if it was a coffin of sorts, not for one, but for many? He had heard whispers in the port of men smuggled across waters in containers, hidden from the eyes of authorities. Some never reached their shores. His stomach turned, bile rising at the thought of what might lie preserved in the cold belly of the cylinder. He shook his head sharply, as though to cast off the thoughts, but they clung to him. His hand lingered over the rusted seam, itching to pry it open, to force an answer from the silence. Yet fear held him back. What if what he found changed everything? What if it was something that should never have been disturbed? The fisherman stepped away, his boots clattering against the wet deck, and sat heavily on a coil of rope, his eyes never leaving the object. For a long while, he simply watched it. The sun shifted in the sky, shadows lengthening, the world moving forward as if nothing unusual had occurred. But for him, the day had already crossed into something else, something irreversible. The sea had given him this, and whether he wanted it or not, he would have to decide what to do with it. He could not return to shore unchanged. He could not live the same life he had yesterday. And so the fisherman sat, his gaze locked on the rusted cylinder sprawled across his deck, the sound of the sea a low whisper around him as though it too were holding its breath. The morning's ordinariness had shattered, replaced with a weight he could not yet measure. The cylinder had risen from the depths, and with it had risen questions darker and heavier than he could bear. The fisherman sat for a long time, his breath shallow and his thoughts restless, staring at the massive cylinder that now occupied nearly half the space of his small deck. The sea around him had returned to its ordinary calm. The sunlight glittered across the waves as if mocking the heaviness that had settled over his heart. What lay before him was not driftwood, not debris from some careless ship, but a thing created by hands, welded and shaped for a purpose that he could not yet decipher. Its very presence on his boat seemed to change the air itself, filling it with tension that made each breath taste metallic, acrid, wrong. He rose slowly, the stiffness in his legs a reminder of the battle he had fought against the net, and approached the object again. The rounded flanks of the cylinder were scarred with rust and encrusted with barnacles, but beneath the layers of corrosion he could see lines too deliberate to be the work of chance. He knelt and traced them with his calloused fingertips, feeling the faint indentation of a seam. It ran straight across one side before vanishing beneath a thick patch of algae. The fisherman leaned closer, scraping with the tip of his knife, clearing away years of growth. The seam widened before his eyes, a line precise and unyielding, unmistakably the edge of a hatch. The realization sent a tremor through him. This was no discarded cistern. It was a container. Something had been placed inside it, sealed away and abandoned to the sea. He shifted his position, examining the sides more carefully. There were several such seams, faint outlines of panels and bolts eaten by rust but still visible. He pressed his ear against the metal, listening, and at first he heard nothing but the rush of his own blood. Then, faintly, like a whisper carried from a distance, came a hollow clink, as though something small had shifted inside. He jerked back at once, his heart hammering, his breath caught. For a long moment, he did not move. His hands hung useless at his sides while his eyes remained fixed on the cylinder. He tried to convince himself it had been nothing more than the trick of the sea rocking his boat, some piece of debris inside settling as the object rolled. But the sound had been sharp, undeniable, and it had struck him with the intimacy of a voice in a silent room. The certainty grew within him that whatever this thing was, it was not empty. He forced himself to circle the object, studying it as if distance might reduce the unease gnawing at his chest. Along one curve of the cylinder, beneath a crust of rust, he saw markings, faint and fractured, yet clearly the remnants of letters and numbers. He crouched low, scraping carefully until the fragments of paint revealed themselves. An L, a 0, and another figure partly lost to corrosion. It was enough to tell him this thing had been catalogued once, recorded and shipped under some system of order. It belonged to someone, somewhere, and it had been sent into the sea with purpose. The fisherman straightened, his face damp with sweat, though the sun was not yet at its peak. His thoughts began to tumble over one another in chaotic fragments. Why would a container be cast into the deep? What had been so important to hide that it required being sealed in iron and abandoned where no one should find it? A chill crawled through him as darker imaginings crept into his mind. He had heard whispers at the docks of smugglers who ferried not just weapons or contraband, but people. Men, women, even children, locked away in holds and crates hidden from the eyes of the law. Some arrived broken, half dead. Others never arrived at all. He shuddered violently and spat over the side of the boat, as though the very thought had poisoned his mouth. His stomach churned with nausea, not only at the possibility of what he might discover, but at the certainty that he, a man who had asked nothing more of the world than his daily catch, had now been forced into proximity with it. The sea had chosen him as its witness. He could not unsee the seams, the markings, the echoing sound within. He could not return to the innocence of ignorance. He sat heavily on the edge of the boat, his eyes never leaving the cylinder. Every instinct screamed at him to cut the ropes and let it slip back into the water, to rid himself of its presence and return to shore with nothing more than fish in his nets and salt in his lungs. Yet his hands remained idle, unwilling to release what had been given. Curiosity clamped down on him like a vice, a gnawing hunger that grew more insistent with each passing moment. What if it held wealth? Treasures stolen and hidden, gold or jewels worth more than he could imagine. What if it was not horror but salvation inside? A chance to escape the chains of poverty that had bound him all his life. The conflict churned within him until he could no longer sit. He rose again and kicked at the cylinder in frustration. It shifted slightly, rocking with a dull, resonant thud that echoed across the deck. He froze, his breath caught in his throat, listening. The sound reverberated into silence, but in that silence he felt the weight of his suspicion deepen into something undeniable. Whatever lay inside, it was not meant to be there. Not meant to be discovered. Not meant to return to the world of the living. The sun climbed higher, baking the air, but the fisherman felt only cold. He wrapped his arms around himself, his gaze locked on the rusted seams as though they might split at any moment and reveal their contents. He thought of his father, of the night the sea had claimed him, and wondered if the old man too had once stumbled across something he was not meant to find. Perhaps that was the sea's way, luring men in with promises of fish and then showing them glimpses of its darker truths. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. He tried to busy himself with other tasks, but his hands refused to obey. Every time he reached for the nets, his eyes returned to the cylinder. Every creak of the boat, every sigh of the waves seemed to originate from its presence. His mind, once filled with simple concerns of survival, now circled endlessly around the same questions. What was inside? Who had sent it here? Why had it been abandoned? By late afternoon he felt hollow, drained by the tension of his own thoughts. He crouched again, laying his palm against the cold surface, and whispered a silent plea to the sea that had been both his friend and his enemy. But the sea gave no answers, only the steady rocking of the waves and the relentless gaze of the sun. The cylinder remained mute, a riddle carved from iron and time, daring him to seek the truth. When at last the fisherman stood, his decision unspoken but already shaping his every thought, he knew there would be no peace for him until he uncovered what lay inside. The fear had not vanished, but it had been joined by a terrible resolve. Whatever waited behind those rusted seams had become his burden. The sea had placed it in his hands, and he could not set it down. As the light began to fade into the slow burn of evening, the fisherman made ready for what he knew must come. He would not throw the cylinder back. He would not abandon it to the deep. He would face its secrets, even if they shattered him. And, with that grim certainty, he felt the weight of suspicion settle not only over the object before him, but into his very soul. The sun dipped low across the horizon, staining the sea with molten streaks of red and gold. The fisherman remained on the deck, his body still and heavy, as though weighted by more than the hours of labor behind him. The great cylinder lay silent at his feet, a presence so dominant it seemed to hum with unspoken intention. It had not moved, had not given another sound since that faint, hollow clink he thought he had heard within, but its stillness was not reassuring. It was the silence of something hidden, waiting, a silence that pressed against him more fiercely than any storm could. He had resisted for as long as he could. He had tried to busy himself with repairs, with sorting ropes and nets, with all the small rituals of a fisherman's life. But every effort ended the same way, with his gaze pulled back, unwilling, to the rusted seams. The markings, half lost to corrosion, still glimmered in his mind, letters and numbers without meaning, like a code designed to mock him. His thoughts churned. He imagined what men might have placed inside, what they had hoped to conceal forever beneath the sea. He thought of smugglers, of contraband and weapons, of poisons sealed away like curses, and he thought, too, of darker possibilities, those whispers that carried from port to port about cargo more precious than gold, human lives hidden and discarded when discovery loomed. He pressed his palms to his face, his breath coming harsh and uneven. The memory of stories returned in fragments, half-remembered voices of old fishermen who spoke of horrors dredged up from the deep, coffins filled with bones, crates marked with foreign tongues, barrels leaking with foul liquids that killed the gulls before they could peck them open. He had laughed at them once, dismissed them as drunken exaggerations meant to chill the night air, but now he felt those same chills running through him, coiling around his ribs and squeezing his heart tight. The cylinder was no myth. It was here, tangible, terrible, and it belonged to him now. He thought of cutting it loose. The knife lay close at hand, and all it would take was one swift slice through the ropes. The sea would claim it again. The weight would drag it down into the dark where it had rested for who knew how many years, and he would be free. He could return to shore with an ordinary story, a day without fish, another empty-handed night to endure, nothing more. But as quickly as the thought came, it was rejected. He could not release it. The sea had placed it in his hands. To cast it back would not erase its existence, only make him a coward before whatever truth it held. Yet fear gnawed at him with equal force. If he opened it, if he pried apart those rusted seams, what would he unleash? What if it held death, not treasure? What if the contents poisoned the very air around him, or cursed him with knowledge he could never unlearn? He closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against the rough wood of the boat's railing. He could almost hear his father's voice, deep and roughened by years of salt and smoke. The sea gives and the sea takes, and sometimes it gives you a thing you should never touch. He whispered his wife's name then, a name he had not spoken aloud in many years. He remembered her laughter, the softness of her voice when she would scold him for staying out too late, her hands weaving nets with a grace his clumsy fingers had never mastered. She had been the anchor that steadied him, the one who had made sense of the endless days of toil. And she was gone, taken not by the sea, but by the cruelty of sickness, leaving him alone with silence. His son had left too, his voice fading into memory, his letters infrequent, his promises of return always postponed. The fisherman realized with a pang that the cylinder was the first thing in years that had forced him to feel something beyond the dull ache of survival. It had stirred terror, yes, but also curiosity, a terrible hunger to know. Night crept slowly across the sky, the horizon bleeding its last light into the sea. Shadows deepened, and the stars began their endless watch. The cylinder gleamed faintly in the moonlight, its wet surface reflecting slivers of silver, its rusted body like the armor of some forgotten beast. The fisherman sat close, his back against the mast, his knife in hand, though he had not yet decided whether it would be used to open or to sever. His thoughts moved in circles, spiraling endlessly, the weight of decision pressing on him until his chest ached. He remembered his father again, a man who had lived by instinct, not reason. His father would have said that fear was a sign to walk away, that a fisherman's life had no room for mysteries that promised only ruin. But he remembered, too, the stories of his father chasing storms, of defying the warnings of neighbors and sailing into waters that no one else dared. There had always been a part of him drawn not just to the sea's bounty, but to its danger, to the secrets that lay just beyond reach. Perhaps that was the true inheritance passed down to him. Not the nets, not the boat, but the hunger to know what others feared. His hand tightened on the knife. He rose slowly, the boards creaking beneath his weight, and stepped closer to the cylinder. He pressed the blade against the seam and scraped, sparks leaping faintly in the darkness. The sound was harsh, grating like the voice of something ancient awakening. He stopped, breathless, and lowered the knife. His hands shook. Not yet. He was not ready yet, but the decision had already been made. He would open it. The fear remained, a living thing inside him, but alongside it grew something stronger, something that pushed him forward. He thought of the years of hunger, of the meager catches, of the endless repetition of days that yielded nothing but survival. If this cylinder held wealth, if it held anything of value, he could change everything. He could bring his son back, could rebuild his home, could live a life not bound by the sea's cruelty. And if it held horror, then at least he would know, at least he would no longer be haunted by the weight of suspicion. The night passed slowly, each hour stretched into eternity. He did not sleep, only sat with the cylinder, watching it as if it might move of its own accord. The moon drifted west, the stars faded, and the sky began to pale again. The fisherman rose with the dawn, weary but resolute. The struggle within him had not ended, but it had found its conclusion. He would not cast it back. He would not live in ignorance. He would face what the sea had given him, no matter the cost. As the first light of morning spread across the water, he reached for his tools, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. The inner battle had been fought, and though fear still clung to him like a shadow, curiosity had won. The sea had delivered its secret to him, and he would uncover it. He could no longer turn away. The new day dawned with a clarity that felt almost cruel in its indifference. The sky stretched wide and unblemished above, painted with soft blues and streaks of pink, as though mocking the turmoil that had gripped the fisherman's heart through the long night. The sea was calm, a shimmering sheet that reflected the rising sun like polished glass, every wavelet catching the light and scattering it into fragments. To any other man, it would have seemed a gift of a perfect morning, but to him there was no peace in it. The great rusted cylinder still sprawled across his deck, its presence blotting out any beauty the world might have offered. He had spent the night wrestling with himself, fighting against the weight of fear and temptation, and though dawn had brought him no rest, it had solidified his resolve. He could not send the cylinder back into the depths. He had to open it. His limbs were heavy from fatigue, his eyes red with sleeplessness, yet his movements carried a strange deliberation now. He knew that everything he did from this moment forward would bring him closer to the answer he both craved and dreaded. He began by searching his modest vessel for tools. There was little he carried beyond what was needed for fishing, but over the years he had gathered odd pieces of iron and wood, items that might serve as makeshift implements in emergencies. From beneath the bench near the bow, he dragged out a rusted crowbar, its surface pitted with age, but still solid. He found a hammer wedged between coils of rope, its wooden handle worn smooth from years of use. A knife, already familiar in his hands, he kept at his belt, though its edge was better suited for cutting nets than metal. He lined them up near the cylinder, each tool a silent promise of what was to come. As he worked, the fisherman was struck by a sense of ritual, as though he were not preparing for simple labor but for some solemn act that demanded reverence. He could not help but feel the weight of unseen eyes upon him, whether of the sea itself, which had delivered this burden into his keeping, or of something hidden within that waited for his decision. The silence of the morning seemed thicker than usual, broken only by the lap of water against the hull. Even the gulls, ever greedy for scraps, had withdrawn from the air above, their absence a disquieting omen. He tested the crowbar against the seam he had uncovered the day before. The metal groaned faintly, flakes of rust falling away like brittle scales. It would take more than one strike, more than one push, to breach the shell that had kept its secret locked for so long. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow though the morning air was still cool. His heart pounded, not from the effort, but from the anticipation of what the act would mean. Once begun, there would be no retreat. The fisherman stepped back and studied the cylinder again. In the rising light, its form seemed even more monstrous, its curved surface gleaming wetly, streaked with decay. It looked less like an object and more like some slumbering beast, armored and ancient, waiting for him to make the first move. He imagined the stories of Pandora's jar, of forbidden vessels opened by hands too curious to resist, and he wondered if he too was about to unleash something that could not be undone. He clenched his fists, trying to silence the whispers of doubt. This was no myth. This was real, and it was his. He moved about the boat in restless circles, tidying ropes that did not need tidying, adjusting sails that did not need adjusting. It was not work he did, but a stalling dance, a delaying of the inevitable. He told himself he was making sure the deck was clear, that nothing would interfere once he began, but in truth he was trying to summon the courage his decision demanded. With each turn, his eyes returned to the tools, lined up like soldiers at the ready, and to the cylinder that seemed to loom larger with every glance. Finally, he could delay no more. He approached the object again, crouching low to inspect the seam. His fingers trembled as they brushed away the last clinging algae. He pressed his ear once more against the metal, straining to hear anything within. At first there was only silence, but then, faintly, a sound came, a dull thud, so soft he could almost convince himself it was the echo of his own heartbeat. He pulled back sharply, his skin crawling, his breath quick and shallow. But the decision held firm within him. Whatever lay inside, he had bound himself to discover it. The air seemed to grow thicker as the sun climbed, pressing heat onto his back, though he could not say whether it was the weather or the fever of his own fear. He picked up the crowbar, testing its weight in his hands. The metal was cool against his palm, reassuring in its solidity. He positioned the tip against the seam and leaned his body into it, the strain running through his arms and shoulders. The cylinder resisted, unyielding, as though mocking his effort. He gritted his teeth and pulled harder, feeling the wood of the handle creak in protest. Rust flaked and fell, dusting the deck with reddish-brown specks. He paused, panting, sweat dripping into his eyes. It would not open easily. That was to be expected. Whoever had sealed it had intended for it to remain sealed. But the thought only hardened his resolve. He struck the seam with the hammer, the sound ringing out across the water, sharp and metallic. The blow echoed in his ears, loud enough to make him wince. He struck again and again, each blow sending vibrations through the deck and into his bones. The cylinder groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed almost alive. The fisherman stepped back, his breath ragged, the hammer heavy in his grip. The echo of his strikes still hung in the air, mingling with the sigh of the sea. He realized that with each blow he was not only fighting against metal, but against time itself, against all the years that had conspired to keep this secret buried. The thought made his heart swell with a strange, almost desperate pride. He was a simple man, a fisherman with nothing but his hands and his will, yet here he was, about to uncover what ships, storms, and the sea itself had hidden. Yet, with that pride came terror. What if he succeeded? What if the contents spilled out and consumed him? He imagined poisonous fumes filling the air, imagined the sea itself turning black with corruption, imagined bones tumbling out to litter his deck with the evidence of atrocity. He gripped the hammer tighter, trying to drive away the visions, but they clung to him with the persistence of barnacles on wood. The day stretched onward, the sun climbing high, the heat bearing down on his weary frame. He alternated between strikes of the hammer and thrusts of the crowbar, the rhythm of his effort mingling with the groans of the cylinder. Hours passed, though he scarcely noticed. His world had narrowed to the rusted seam before him, the tools in his hands and the pounding of his heart. Every strike brought him closer to the truth, and every moment of resistance deepened his obsession. By late afternoon, exhaustion forced him to pause. He slumped against the mast, his chest heaving, his muscles aching. The cylinder lay unchanged, save for the scars he had etched into its surface. Yet he knew progress had been made. The seam had widened, if only slightly. The first cracks in its armor had been born, and through them seeped the promise of revelation. He closed his eyes, letting the salt air fill his lungs, trying to summon strength for what lay ahead. The struggle within him had not ended, but it had found its outlet in action. The tools were ready, his will was firm, and the sea itself seemed to wait, holding its breath for the moment when iron would yield to man. The fisherman rose once more, his body weary but his spirit ablaze. He placed the crowbar back into the seam, his hand steady now despite the trembling of his limbs. The moment of opening drew near. He could feel it in the air and the way the boat rocked softly as though anticipating the weight of change. He whispered no prayers, offered no words to the sky or the sea. He had already chosen his path, and all that remained was to see it through. As the light of day began to wane, casting long shadows across the water, the fisherman stood ready. The cylinder loomed before him, scarred and defiant, its secrets intact but weakening. Tomorrow, or perhaps even before the night was over, he would break through. The preparation was complete, the tools were in place. His heart, though burdened with fear, no longer faltered. He would open it. He must. The fisherman's hands ached from the day before, his shoulders stiff with fatigue, yet when dawn returned he was already on his feet, staring at the rusted cylinder as if it had been watching him all night in return. He had dreamed of it, though whether in sleep or in waking visions he could not say. In the dreams, the seam yawned open of its own accord, and a tide of black water spilled forth, carrying with it whispers that had no tongue. He had woken with his throat dry and his chest tight, but the fear had not been enough to dissuade him. He had prepared, he had struggled, and now the time had come. The sky was overcast, the first gray clouds of days gathering above him, dulling the brilliance of the sea. The light seemed subdued, as though the world itself knew what he was about to do and dared not brighten the moment. He picked up the crowbar again, its metal chilled with the morning air, and wedged it deep into the scar he had opened along the seam. The iron groaned in protest, a moan that echoed in his ears like the sound of something ancient unwilling to yield. He leaned in with all his weight, his teeth clenched, his muscles burning. Rust fell in a fine rain, peppering the deck with reddish dust. For long minutes nothing happened, and then, with a sound like a sigh torn from a chest, the seam widened. The fisherman staggered back, breathless, his heart thundering. He had breached it. The barrier that had held against salt and pressure and time itself had begun to crumble beneath his hands. There was no turning back. He lifted the hammer and struck hard against the edge, once, twice, 3 times, each blow ringing through the hull, each one pulling the crack a little wider. The sound filled the air, louder than the sea, louder than the cries of gulls. With every strike he felt himself tremble, not from weakness, but from the nearness of revelation. The seam split further, and at last the crowbar slipped deeper into the wound of the metal. He pulled, straining, and the hatch shuddered. A sharp hiss escaped, faint but unmistakable, as though air long trapped was finally escaping its prison. The stench came next, sudden and violent, a wave of foulness that struck him in the face and knocked the breath from his lungs. He staggered backward, choking, his eyes watering as he gagged. It was the smell of rot and rust, of water gone stagnant, of something that had festered in darkness for years. He pressed his sleeve against his mouth, fighting back nausea, but the odor clung to him, burrowing into his nostrils, coating his tongue. Still, he did not retreat. He forced himself forward, blinking tears away, gripping the crowbar with renewed fury. He drove it deeper, pulled harder, until with a final screech the hatch gave way and swung outward. The sound of metal tearing itself apart echoed into the morning, and then there was silence, silence heavier than before, a silence that seemed to hold its breath with him as he peered inside. At first, he saw nothing but shadow. The darkness within was thicker than the night, a void that seemed almost solid. His lamp, small and worn from years at sea, flickered as he raised it toward the opening. The beam pierced the gloom and revealed shapes, indistinct, huddled, piled one upon the other. For a heartbeat, his mind refused to comprehend what his eyes saw. Then the truth struck him with the weight of a storm. Bodies. They were packed together, pressed into the cylinder like fish in a barrel. The first lay curled against the hatch, its skin shriveled and darkened by time, its clothing in tatters. Beyond it were others, limbs entangled, faces half hidden, all frozen in grotesque silence. Some were small, heartbreakingly small, the size of children who had never known what it was to run on open ground. Empty eye sockets and gaping mouths stared at him through the gloom, mouths that seemed still to cry out, though no sound emerged. The fisherman stumbled back, his lamp shaken in his hand, casting frantic shadows across the horror within. His legs weakened, and he dropped to his knees on the deck, retching until nothing remained in his stomach. He pressed his forehead against the wood, his breath ragged, his mind refusing, denying, yet the image was burned into his vision. They had been alive once. That knowledge clung to the air heavier than the stench. These were not cargo, not forgotten relics. They were people. With trembling hands, he forced himself upright and looked again, compelled by a morbid gravity he could not resist. The walls of the cylinder were scarred with scratches, deep gouges where nails had clawed desperately at the iron. Words were carved, too, crude and jagged, in a language he recognized only from fragments heard in the port. He could not read them all, but he understood their meaning. Pleas, prayers, hope written into steel with the last strength of the dying. His knees shook, and he pressed himself back against the mast, gasping. His thoughts roared with questions, with visions of how they had come to be here. He saw in his mind faceless men, smugglers and slavers, herding frightened souls into the hollow belly of the cylinder, sealing them in as though they were less than animals. He imagined the voyage, the darkness, the air thinning, the cries echoing until one by one they fell silent. And then, perhaps to avoid discovery, the whole container had been cast into the sea, discarded like rubbish, their lives extinguished not by storm or accident, but by cruelty. The fisherman wept then, the sound torn from him without shame. His tears fell into the grime on his hands, streaking his skin with salt and rust. He had thought to find treasure, perhaps salvation. Instead, he had uncovered a grave. The weight of it pressed into his chest until he could barely breathe. He thought of his wife, of his son, of all he had lost, and though his grief had been deep, it was nothing compared to the silence of those who had perished here. They had not been given even the dignity of the sea's embrace. They had been locked away, abandoned, forgotten. Until now. The gulls returned at last, circling overhead, their cries shrill and discordant, as though announcing to the empty sky what he had discovered. The fisherman raised his face to them, his vision blurred with tears, and whispered words that no one heard. He did not know what he could do, what he must do, but he knew he could not keep this secret. The sea had chosen him as witness, and he would carry that burden ashore. He staggered to his feet, every limb heavy, and looked once more at the cylinder. The hatch hung open, its secret spilled into the light of day, the silence of its occupants screaming louder than any storm. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, his body trembling, and reached for the tiller. The boat turned slowly toward the distant line of the coast, its course steady, though the fisherman's heart was anything but. The sea stretched endless before him, calm and bright, as though nothing at all had changed. Yet he knew the world was not the same as it had been when he set out that morning. He had opened the cylinder. He had seen what lay within, and the knowledge of it would haunt him forever. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next shocking story. Click now to watch the next video. It's even more unbelievable than this one. And if this story left you speechless, share it with your friends. Let them be shocked too,